complicated emotion. It is, in some sense, what the genes would have a very complicated creature like us, who has self-reflection and reasons, would end up saying, I matter, and then ask, and why exactly do I matter? You come to the conclusion, not so quickly, right? It's taken us millennia. It's, you know, because I come from this tribe, or I'm a member of this race, or this people, or I'm this gender, or whatever. Slowly, slowly, slowly. It's taken us a very long time to actually get to the point, and moral philosophy has helped us a great deal here, that what it is in virtue of which I matter is the same in virtue of which we all matter.
Why do so many people then tussle with the question of do I matter? Like, why do so many of us struggle with the meaning of life then?
Well, we're all pretty much painfully self-aware of all our inadequacies. People know that they're finite and brutally breakable and capable of reprehensible actions. And it makes all of us doubt the validity of our claim to a continued untrammeled existence. And we have to bear the existential guilt that that knowledge of finitude and insufficiency and malevolence leaves us with. And I would say that's part of the call to noble action as an antidote to precisely that. And that call to what you could be rather than what you are. And that's a good call to meaning. I also had an answer to your question. I had a dream. I had a dream once, and I'm speaking psychologically here, not theologically. I had a dream once. I was in the cemetery of an old church, an old cathedral, surrounded by the graves, and there were indentations in the grounds where all the graves were, and all of a sudden the graves started to open, and it was a graveyard where great people, great men of the past had been buried, and so grave opened and an armed king stood up, and then another grave opened and another armed king stood up, and this happened all around me, and these were very formidable figures, right? They were the great heroes of the past, and after a number of them appeared on the scene, they looked around and saw each other, and being warrior types, they immediately started to fight. And the question is, what stops the great kings of the past from fighting? And I had a revelation after the dream. I can't remember if it was part of it, but yes, it was part of the dream. They all bowed down to the figure of Christ. I thought, and then I woke up and I thought, what in the world does that dream mean? What in the world could that possibly mean? And then I understood it. I understood that if you have 20 kings, let's say, and you took the thing that was most king-like about each of them, and then you combined it into a single figure, then you'd get a single figure of transcendent heroism, of transcendent good. And it's a tenet of the Jungian school of psychology, let's say, that that figure of transcendent good is symbolized by the image of Christ. And the purpose of that image is so that even the tyrannical king has someone to bend his knee to. And that's absolutely vital. I mean, you don't have to approach it from a religious perspective, although you inevitably do, because when you speak of things at this level, that's what happens. But you need an image of the transcendent embodied good to serve as something that unites the great tyrants of the past. It's something like that. It's an emergent vision of embodied unity. And it's a psychological necessity. It's a sociological necessity. And I think it bears very strongly on your question about why is it that people matter. It's the classic Western answer to that, the Judeo-Christian answer to that, is because you have a spark of divinity within you, and that divinity is a reflection of this transcendent good. And it's obligatory for me to recognize that in you and vice versa if we're going to inhabit the same territory without mayhem, peacefully and with the ability to cooperate. Now, you might say, well, the mere fact that a transcendent image is necessary as a uniting figure doesn't prove the reality of that image. But I would say, well, yes, but it doesn't disprove it, and it strongly hints at something more profound, especially when you also ally it with the observation that the encounter with something truly admirable produces the instinct of awe. And that's not a rational instinct. It's an irrational instinct, but it's a marker that you're in the presence of something greater than yourself. And it's not something that you have voluntary control over. It's something that overtakes you. And it could easily be a reflection of the truth. Now, you can make a biologically reductionistic argument about that, but it starts to become extraordinarily difficult because you enter into the realm where these transcendent experiences of religious significance and awe are a phenomenological and psychological reality. And it's not easy to explain why that's the case. So,
may I just say that I'm somewhat... I am somewhat suspicious of the transcendent. Some things that make us feel part of something greater.
What makes people matter is transcendent. You said that already.
No. I said I did not. No. I said I was using a transcendental kind of argument, a la Kant. That is
transcendental.
This is not. This is different from transcendence.
Well,
no,
if it's the same for everyone, it's transcendent because it transcends the individual. If there's something about every individual that matters,
then human
it's transcendent.
Nature is transcendent, right? Because
that's fine with me.
That's fine with me too. Okay, that's good with me.
There's a vocabulary confusion here that needs to be cleared up. You're talking about a transcendent reality beyond the natural realm. Rebecca doesn't believe in such a reality. She says everything is confined to the laws of nature and things subject to that. But she's using the word transcendental, a transcendental argument like Kant, where in order to justify, for example, reasoning, you show that without the assumption of reasoning, you couldn't even deny the validity of reasoning. It's almost kind of pulling it up by your bootstraps sort of argument. That's what you're talking about, right?
It creates the very conditions for coherence in our life, right? And I would say, there are transcendental arguments for logic, for induction, for deduction, for induction, and I would say for moral reasoning as well, that there are certain preconceptions that are, we can't live our life coherently without them. We can stop with ourselves, but if we push it further, that's exactly what the Spinoza's project was, a completely naturalist deduction of ethics. He calls it the ethics. It had a profound effect on European history. It took 100 years, but it seeded the Enlightenment, from which so much moral progress has derived, that I am very much a beneficiary of it as a woman, as a Jew. I am very much a beneficiary of that, of what came from the Enlightenment. What did I want? But the thing that I was that makes me the bigger, being part of a movement that bigger makes us more than we are. This kind of trying to transcend our humanity. That makes me very nervous because again, the imprint on my mind is always both the victims of the greatest horror that I know of, and the perpetrators of it, who felt so transcendent, those Nazis, right? They were part of a very larger-than-life movement that made them feel, talk about symbols galore, spectacle galore. It was a kind of drunkenness, of transcendence. I have a horror of that. I'm nervous about that. Give me music, give me art, give me great novels, give me poetry, that kind of transcendence. But the sort of transcendence, that is the transcendence that makes us feel all at one in our humble humanity. That kind of transcendence I believe in. But I don't like the larger symbolic, we are transcending our human condition. Let's just be human. That would be triumph enough.
We want to move very quickly into starting to take questions because the time is moving. But first, I want to talk about the Twinkie in the room, because that really is about religion. I think putting rules on. You have an answer to the meaning of life that religion would be a freedom experience, I'm sure. Can you respond to that, Dr. Craig?
I didn't catch the question.
Just this idea of religion being an oppressive reality versus a meaningful reality for the meaning of life.
I think that the argument that I have offered this evening is simply irrelevant to the societal effects of religion. You cannot judge the truth or falsity of a worldview based upon its societal impact. For example, Einstein's theories of relativity, being largely misunderstood, led to a cultural relativism where people thought he meant or taught everything is relative. They didn't understand the difference between relativity and relativism. And so in some ways, relativity theory has had negative cultural consequences in terms of promoting a kind of moral relativism. Does that show the theory is false? Of course not. The truth or falsity of a worldview doesn't depend upon its societal impact. And so as a philosopher, I'm just not that bothered or interested in what are the social implications of theism. I'm talking about a metaethical argument, a metaphysical argument that will give us an objective grounding for significance, human value, and purpose in life that can then be fleshed out in practical, normative ways.
This is from a viewer. How does your perspective on the meaning of life account for evil and suffering? Would you like to take that first, Dr. Peterson?
Well, I read something very interesting many decades ago. It was a Jewish meditation on finitude. And it was presented in what you might describe as a Jewish Zen koan. And there aren't that many of those. So here was the question. What does a being who's omniscient, omnipresent, and omnipotent lack? So those are the three classical attributes of God. And the answer was limitation. And that was the reason for the creation of man. That there's something about limitation that the absolute lacks. Say, well, being requires limitation, let's say, because if you can be anything at all at any moment, then you're everything at once, and in some sense, you're nothing at all. We're in this situation. Our being is defined by our limitations, and that produces suffering. The question is whether there is a mode of being that justifies the suffering. That's the fundamental religious question. And I think that the answer to that is yes. So being requires limitation. Limitation necessitates suffering, but there are modes of being that allow you to transcend the suffering. That's the hope. And then with regards to evil, it seems to me, I have to speak physically or theologically here, that a universe without the possibility of evil is also one without the possibility of good. And I would say that if human beings conducted themselves properly, we could have a universe where free choice was the rule. We were free to choose evil, but there would be no evil because we would choose good. And I think that we should be very careful at laying the existence of evil at the feet of the Creator without looking to our own role in producing it. So that's my answer to that question.
Dr. Craig, would you like to? Okay. This is a question for you specifically, Dr. Peterson. Do you believe religions like Christianity have a role in the pursuit of discovering that which is opposite of evil?
I think that that is what they are, fundamentally. I've spent a lot of time trying to understand the underlying narrative structure of the Bible, for example. It's a very strange collection of books, but it has a narrative structure. And the narrative structure is something like, well, people fell into history when they became self-conscious. And because they were self-conscious, conscious of their own limitations, conscious of suffering itself, they were also able to become and motivated to become resentful and cruel and bitter and homicidal and genocidal. And that's, I suppose, in some sense, the genesis of evil. Our life is bounded by suffering and tainted by malevolence. And there's a pathway through that. And as far as I can tell, the entire Bible is a meditation on the pathway through that. Now, it's not a meditation we understand because most of it's story. It's embedded in stories. And stories are the way that we transmit information that we don't yet understand. So, but I think that the Bible, properly understood, is the best, what would you say? It's the best set of instructions that we have to understand what it would mean to live a life that would enable us to bear suffering nobly and to constrain malevolence. That's what it looks like to me. I mean, I can give you a quick example of that. There's an idea, deep idea, that emerges in the first chapter of Genesis, that being that extracts habitable order out of nothingness and potential uses truthful speech to do that as the mechanism by which that occurs. And that the habitable order that's extracted from the chaotic potential by truthful speech is good. And that the capacity to do that is part and parcel of each human being, something I believe to be as accurate as anything can be accurate. And so there's an idea right in the beginning, right in the first chapter of that book, that if people spoke truthfully, that the order they spoke into being would be good. And I believe that to be the case. And I think that people experience that in their own lives. You know what happens if you lie to yourself. You know what happens if you lie to other people and betray them. You produce little pockets of hell within you and around you. And if you cease to do that, then things improve. And that begs the question of just how good they could get if we cease to do that altogether. So.
Thank you. Dr. Craig, this question is for you.
Right.
Why does the lack of ultimate significance entail the lack of temporary significance?
It seems to me that in order for something to be significant, to be important, it needs to make a difference. That's what it means to be significant. And so if no matter what you do, everything winds up the same, your choices are ultimately insignificant. That is to say, they're inconsequential. And on naturalism, all of our choices, the entire human race, is ultimately inconsequential. It doesn't matter. It's insignificant. And that seems to me to be virtually undeniable on on atheism.
May I deny it?
Excuse me?
May I deny it?
Sure.
You know, somehow it's this temporality that seems to really matter to you. You know, that unless it is, you say, you're right, it's almost a tautology. In order for something to be significant, it has to make a difference. But why can't it just make a difference for some duration and not forever? If somebody is in pain, is suffering, and I can do something to take that suffering away, that matters. And it doesn't matter that neither I nor the sufferer will exist, you know,
let's
forever.
Remember that my argument is a tripartite argument, and there are three components to it: purpose, value, and significance. Now, I agree that if things have objective moral worth and value, then their being merely temporary does not mean that they're insignificant. That in that case, you can have significance despite its transitoriness in virtue of its moral worth. But my argument is that in the absence of God, there isn't any objective foundation for the affirmation of objective moral values and duties. These are simply illusions fobbed off on us by the socio-biological evolutionary process. And therefore, you can't rescue significance by appealing to the inherent moral worth of temporary things.
If it were only the biological process, the evolutionary process, how could it be that through reflection, slowly, far too slowly, we actually can make progress, right? Everything. There's nothing more biologically determined than male dominance over women. Nothing is more, right? This is...
Well, now wait, Rebecca. By what? By what?
You underestimate women.
We have our ways, but you know, but we are slowly, you know, there's all sorts of behavior that is biologically determined, right? Xenophobia. I spent a lot of time in Africa observing the chimps. It was one of the most amazing experiences for me. I mean, I came back and I could only see, I came back to a conference, actually, and there were two men on either side of me. So this is my fate, this is my doom. They were arguing over me, and there was a little lady in between, and, you know, and they were pointing their fingers and blah, 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 and trying also to impress me a little bit. And you know, all I could see was what I had just seen in Uganda, right? These men.
You mean among the bonobos and the chimps?
Not bonobos. Oh, bonobos are entirely different. Bonobos are
fair
female.
enough, but the point is
among
that
the chimps,
the same sort of social behavior exhibited by Homo sapiens is already present in their primate relatives, like baboons and chimpanzees.
Yes.
And there is no reason to invest human morality with any more objective significance than that kind of behavior that evolution is programmed into other primate species because it's advantageous in the struggle for survival. It's just a herd morality.
That is not how we progress.
That's not
what civilization is, what moral progress is.
Wait, where do you get the word progress?
Oh, yes, I get the progress.
A naturalistic worldview? I think on a naturalistic worldview, you would be justified in talking about moral change. But the word progress smuggles in a standard.
No. But that's because you think on a naturalist basis, on a purely naturalist basis, there is